that you're all here. I'm Serene Jones, the president at Union Theological Seminary, and this is my amazing colleague and dear friend, the Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas, the Dean of the Episcopal Divinity School at Union.
Thank you, Serene. Thank you, and thank you, Serene, who again is my dear friend and colleague. And good evening to all of you. I am privileged to be here for this very special night, and am looking forward, as I am sure all of you are, to hearing these two acclaimed activists discuss some of the crises facing our nation today. Union is known as a place that develops moral leaders like Naomi Klein and Michelle Alexander. It's a place where faith and scholarship meet to reimagine the work of justice. Whether that work is dismantling racism and every form of discrimination that currently haunts us.
And that work includes responding to our climate crisis. Like, especially tonight, we want to thank Union's Center for Earth Ethics, led by the remarkable Corinna Gore. It's a center that unites environmentalism with religious and humanistic moral concerns by actively advocating on behalf of the most vulnerable people, communities, and ecosystems. It's this type of bracing, committed, truth-telling advocacy that our guest tonight, Naomi Klein, is known for. She is an award-winning journalist and author who has written about how our government has tried to dismiss climate science, the devastating consequences of such denial, and the profit-driven economics behind the destruction of our earth and of our future. She has also spoken out against global capitalism and the violent impact it is having on communities in America and around the world. You may know her books, I'm sure you do. That's why you're here. This Changes Everything: Capitalism versus the Climate. Shock Doctrine: The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. And her most recent book, No is Not Enough: Resisting Trump's Shock Politics and Winning the World We Need. Her list of accomplishments and awards is as long as the chronicle of her brave journalism and insistent activism. Most recently, in November of 2016, she was awarded Australia's prestigious Sydney Peace Prize for, and in the words of the prize's jury, for exposing the structural causes and responsibility for the climate crisis, and for inspiring us to stand up locally, nationally, and internationally to demand a new agenda for sharing the planet that respects human rights and equality at every turn, and thank her for reminding us of the power of authentic democracy as it seeks to achieve transformative change and justice.
Leading the conversation tonight will be my colleague, Michelle Alexander, known, I'm sure, to all of you. Michelle is a visiting professor at Union, an acclaimed civil rights lawyer, advocate, and author of the book, The New Jim Crow: Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. Michelle exudes integrity and a passion for justice. So I know that we are in tonight for quite an inspiring, challenging discussion. We hope that all of you gathered here who use social media will join the conversation on Twitter and Facebook using the hashtag Spirit of Justice. And we hope that you will share with your followers that tonight's conversation is being live streamed, and the entire event will be posted to the Union YouTube channel much later.
So now, without any further delay, join me in welcoming Michelle Alexander and Naomi Klein.
Good evening. How's everyone doing tonight? Thank you so much for being here. And thank you to Serene Jones and Kelly Brown Douglas for the warm, warm welcome and generous introductions, and to all those at Union Theological Seminary who have helped to make this event possible. I know it takes a lot of hard work to put an event like this together, and I'm really grateful for your efforts. And Naomi, thank you for being here. I'm just thrilled to have you here. I've been looking forward to this conversation for over a year now. We met for the first time in person just over a year ago, right before Trump's inauguration. There was a convening of movement thinkers and activists from a wide range of movements, folks from Black Lives Matter, from climate change and climate justice movements, women's rights, queer activists, indigenous activists, folks fresh from Standing Rock at the time, people who were involved in labor organizing, labor activists. It was just an incredible group of activists from across the spectrum who were gathered together, still a little bit shell-shocked from the election results, but determined to make sense of what had happened and also to form a united front in resistance to the Trump administration, and to think very carefully about how this moment in our history might allow us to actually breathe new life into our movements and think bigger and bolder in the years to come. It was a fantastic gathering in many ways, but it was also revealing, because probably by the second day into the gathering, it became clear that we found it very easy to unite in terms of what we were against, but we had a lot more difficulty defining with clarity what we were for. And that experience I've had in a number of movement spaces. The challenges of defining clarity. What's the big vision that we're ultimately fighting for when there's a wide range of people in the room, some of which who are uncomfortable saying the word capitalism out loud, some people who are less comfortable with talking about patriarchy, people who have different comfort levels in their own work, partially because of funding and other issues. But that experience and many others inspired me to continue the conversation that we began. You had so much to contribute of value to that gathering, and this forum, the Spirit of Justice Dialogues, is really meant to give a platform to brilliant, bold, courageous, revolutionary thinkers who are challenging how we see, understand, interpret, and respond to the world. And you have challenged me in really important ways. You have challenged me to think differently about capitalism and what is necessary at this time of climate crisis. So I just want to welcome you again, and thank you for being here. And I want to begin by just asking you if you would be willing to share on a personal level a little bit with us. I think of you as a revolutionary, as someone who is deeply engaged in the project of trying to reimagine the kind of world and democracy we want to have, and fighting for it. But I wonder whether you think of yourself as a revolutionary, and if you could share a little bit about how you came to justice work and kind of became the thinker that you are.
Well, first of all, I'd just love to say how happy I am to be here and thank everybody who's part of the union community for welcoming here. I feel the weight of history in this amazing church, and I'm just so happy to be in conversation with you, Michelle. And I think you know how mutual the learning has been between the two of us. And in fact, we talked on the phone before that gathering about how we felt like we had sort of been reaching towards each other from different places in our work, and that we really should talk. And it's just every time I talk with you and read you, I learn something new, and I'm so intensely grateful for your honesty and ethics and brilliance. I think of myself, to be honest, first and foremost, as a researcher, as an investigator. I come to politics through my journalism, and my journalism, my research, my analysis has brought me to a progressively more radical place. I follow my research where it leads me. And I think there's been a trajectory in my books where I think I started off from a place that was a little bit more kind of nostalgic about a sort of kinder, gentler capitalism. I thought maybe we could turn back the clock. Where I am now, after a couple decades of this work, and increasingly in a more political space, not just reporting but organizing, I am utterly convinced that the scale of the crises we face requires revolutionary change. That whether we're talking about the ecological crisis, whether we're talking about white supremacy, whether we're talking about toxic masculinity, whether we're talking about grotesque levels of inequality and poverty and dispossession, whether we're talking about the treatment of migrants around the world, the fact that more people are on the move right now than at any point since the Second World War, the scale of the intersecting, interrelated crises that we face requires systemic change. That reformism is not up to our historical moment. And I think nothing has convinced me of that more than really just studying climate science and understanding the depth and speed of change that is required. And we can, maybe come back to that. So I would say, as an analyst, I have no doubt about the need for that depth of change, this sort of punctuated transformation on multiple fronts. Whether I feel some discomfort in calling myself a revolutionary, because I don't think I've earned that, and I don't know, I don't know that you can be a revolutionary without a revolution. And I like to think that if there was one, I would show up. I think that, I think there are a great many people, and more people than at any point that I've been politically conscious, that recognize this need for deep change. But I don't believe that we have a movement, and this comes back to what you were saying about the sort of frustration of these coming togethers and breaking apart, and this reaching and not quite managing the movement that is a measure of our moment yet. I haven't given up, and I don't think you have either. I don't think we have I think a revolutionary movement needs a plan. It doesn't just need that vision of what we want. It also needs plan. It also needs a structure. And I am fully committed to being part of movements that are building that. and I like to think that if we get there, I'll be a revolutionary, but I'm not sure I can. I don't know, do you feel like you can call yourself a revolutionary?
Well, you know, it's interesting. When Angela Davis was here, I asked her a similar question, and she said, you know, I'm trying to be a revolutionary.
Yeah.
And I thought that was kind of a wonderful way of describing it. There's a scene in a documentary about the Black Panther Party, and I'm forgetting right now what the title of it is. There's a scene where Fred Hampton is standing in front of a crowd, delivering a really impassioned speech, and at some point he says, I am a revolutionary. I am a revolutionary. And he's inviting the audience to join in. And slowly you see, one by one, people in the crowd beginning to say it and join in the chant and stand up one by one. And it was people of all different races and backgrounds kind of claiming it, saying, I'm willing to commit myself to working towards a radically different world. And it was just this powerful moment that caused me to reflect on, wow, am I there yet? Am I at a place where I can say I'm committed to that in that way? And that's one of the reasons why I asked the question. I'm trying to be, and I'm leaning into that as best I can. And you know, one of the reasons I asked the question too is that you know, I think there's a lot of frustration right now with Trump voters and Trump sympathizers. And certainly I have had a lot of frustration even with kind of mainstream Democrats who kind of play along with systems and politics that I feel have been disastrous for poor people and people of color. But in those moments of frustration, I also have to acknowledge that I didn't always think the way that I do now. That I wasn't born thinking that we needed a radically new system of justice, or that we needed to reimagine our democracy, or to ask deep questions about capitalism. I wasn't born that way, and I certainly wasn't raised in a family that was asking those questions. And so how we get from, you know, a place of being born into a nation where so much injustice is normalized, how we get from being someone who has absorbed that through osmosis or through our family or through our culture or through television to someone who's actually willing to question it and take risks and stand together with others as part of movements that are challenging the systems in deep way, I think is an important part of us thinking more critically about how we go about building our movements. So my question was partly, how did you, when you weren't born criticizing capitalism, was it because of the work that you did as a journalist, going to countries, investigating the way in which austerity programs were operating? Or what was it that began your path to asking the kinds of questions that you've been asking, you know, with such brazenness now for many years?
I mean, I'm certainly changed by my research, and the research that I do is the kind of research where I go there. You know, I mean, I'm not just sort of writing from my desk about, you know, what is going on in, you know, sweatshops in Indonesia, which was, you know, a big part of my first book that I wrote in my 20s, or, you know, the overthrow of democratic governments. I mean, I do a lot of field research. I'm changed by my research. I meet people who blow my mind and change my worldview. I identify with the people I write about, you know. But I feel a little bit illegitimate in this question because, I mean, it is a journey. And you know, I have changed in my journey, and my experiences have pushed me to a different place than where I started. And I think we always have to remember that. We can't expect people to be where we are. But that said, I see an appetite for radicalism among young people today that certainly wasn't true of my generation. Like, they're like a lot more ready for it and drawn to it. Like, if you're out there saying, you know, this is a plan for a revolution, people will show up. in a way where I think for my generation, we felt that would be a liability. You wouldn't want to admit you were a revolutionary because, I grew up in the neoliberal, 80s and 90s. But the reason why I say I feel a little bit illegitimate is because I was kind of born into it.
Well, that's part of your story.
Yeah, it is part of my story. And so, so here I'll do my lefty confessional. We're all friends here, right? This is where Martin Luther King delivered the Beyond Vietnam speech, right? Before I was born. So I'm a child of Vietnam War draft resistors. And the reason why I live in Canada is because my father was a draft dodger, was a war resistor. And so, he faced this choice. So this is the story that I grew up with. This is the story that I was told about who I am, why we live where we live in this country where we don't have any family, why we're afraid to cross the border. Like all of that is stuff that happened before I was born. My father, and mother fled to Canada when my mom was pregnant. My dad didn't want to go to jail. They heard that there was a customs agent at the Montreal airport, Dorval, that was sympathetic to draft dodgers if you flew in at midnight, and they did it, and they had landed immigrant status by Monday morning, because at the time we had a government that didn't just make memes about how immigrants were welcome, but actually welcomed a lot of immigrants, and so I grew up with these stories about, why it was important to not be part of the war machine, that you take actions and they do have consequences, and one of the reasons why my father decided, like he had filed for conscientious objector status, but he had been raised in a very left family. His parents were socialists in Newark. His father was an artist, and actually had a job working for Walt Disney. And this was another really important story for me, was hearing these stories about my grandfather, who was, he was an animator. So, for kids, Disney is everything, right? And so it was a huge source of pride to me that my grandfather had animated some of my favorite movies. Like they could point to the scene, in Bambi, or, and that was the part that he'd animated. He was actually in charge of Donald Duck continuity, which was making sure that people drew Donald Duck exactly the same way in every frame. And my grandfather was like magic. He would draw on a napkin, in 4 strokes, and suddenly it was Donald Duck. But so that was true, and that was this amazing thing. And then the other thing that I grew up learning was that he had organized a union. I had been one of the key organizers of the first animator strike in Anaheim, and had not only been fired but blacklisted and never been able to work as an artist again, and it had really shattered his life. And so just kind of I grew up very much with this idea of like, there's this story behind the shiny happy story, right? And knowing that like Disney had done this terrible thing to my grandfather, like the shiniest, happiest thing for kids, and just trying to hold these two ideas in my head, I think is what turned me into an investigative journalist, because it was sort of like, I feel like I've always been, like my whole life I've been trying to like peel back the shine, like what's behind it, like what's behind the happy face. And also trying to kind of hold these ideas in these tensions of like, but I'm drawn to this, and we're still allowed to kind of like the movies but yet we think that, blacklisting and testifying before the House of Un-American Activities and all of that is really awful. So, these are the narratives of my childhood, and that I think that definitely put me on this journey of trying to understand, the stories behind the stories we're told.
Well, I love that story, because it turns out some people are born revolutionaries. And, I think that's, even what that means for many of us raising children at this time, and how we talk about this particular political moment and how we're responding to it, and what our kids see us doing or not doing in these times is all very important and meaningful. One of the things that I really appreciate about the evolution of your work, and I guess I appreciate it because it parallels in many ways the evolution of mine, is that you have increasingly argued that we don't need simply kind of just a political revolution or even an economic one, but that ultimately we really need to have kind of a moral revolution, and that it's impossible to develop kind of a plan of action for change if we don't, examine very carefully our kind of values and recognize that these are moral questions and not purely political ones or economic ones. And so I want to get to that in a little bit. But first, your book, The Shock Doctrine, really helped clarify for me how devastating capitalism not only has been in the United States but around the world in many respects. But what became particularly clear for me wasn't just the harm, but the way in which capitalism has actually been forced on so many nations around the world in a way that I frankly didn't realize, coming up in college, going to grad school and law school, somewhere along the line, I was never taught that, for example, as you explain in your book, that the first real kind of full-on experiment with Milton Friedman's brand of capitalism was in Chile, and that it happened as a result of a CIA-supported coup where capitalism more or less was forced upon a nation that had actually democratically elected a socialist government. And the story of what happened in Chile and how disasters have been used around the world as a way of forcing kind of free market, supposedly free market principles on nations was brand new to me and helped me to think differently about capitalism and the ways in which it has been naturalized, had been naturalized even for me. And so I wonder if you could say a little bit about the thesis of the Shock Doctrine and what got you interested in studying, the reality of how capitalism was playing out in these countries and how governments were really being kind of forced to adopt practices that their populations actually didn't ever want.
Well, I mean, you and I are the same, roughly the same age, and we both grew up with the real sales job for capitalism,
Yeah.
right? That there is no alternative, that the bundling of capitalism and democracy, right? Which was the name of Milton Friedman's book, Capitalism and Democracy. It was the 2-for-1, right? It was a package deal. And when Francis Fukuyama declared the end of history, what he said specifically was that liberal democracy in the political sphere and free markets in the economic sphere are the only way to run societies. And this was the marketing. This was the shiny, happy story of capitalism. This was Thomas Friedman in the New York Times saying no two countries with a McDonald's have ever gone to war, right? And so what made me want to re-examine that story, I mean, it was, all my books take, besides the most recent one, which was written in a mad panic after Trump was elected. It takes me 5 years to write these books, and they change, as I'm writing them. But that book is like what I mean by the shock doctrine is a political strategy to use large-scale shocks and traumas to societies to get rid of any pretense of democracy, sometimes, as in the case of Chile, quite literally with a coup d'etat, but sometimes just using the trauma of a terrorist attack, a natural disaster, a massive economic crisis, and or the collapse of what you thought your country was, like the collapse of the Soviet Union, to very rapidly push through what economists used to call shock therapy. They stopped calling it shock therapy because they realized that sounded bad. But the idea was what I call the shock doctrine was using a very real shock and the window of opportunity that opens up in the disorientation and trauma to ram through very rapid fire transformations of society along neoliberal lines: privatization, deregulation, low corporate taxes, offset with massive cuts to the social sphere, always accompanied by increased militarization of society, increased incarceration of all the people who are thrown out in this process, right? And what got me on this, just backing up a little bit, was 9/11, was the huge shock in this city and around the world. And the reason for that was that I had been part of this movement in the years before 9/11, which was in the media called the anti-globalization movement. It was actually a rising anti-capitalist movement around the world that was taking on the ways in which these very policies were being pushed onto countries particularly through free trade agreements, and through the World Trade Organization. And this was this moment, the huge protests in Seattle in 1999, and then any time there was a gathering of sort of global elites, there was, ended up being 100,000 people in Genoa. It was a really large growing movement. And it was a movement that was internationalist, that had a systemic analysis. I think it was significant that it rose up in this country during the Clinton years, in that it wasn't about partisan politics. It was really about diagnosing what both of these parties had in common and what they were delivering in terms of income inequality, but from a progressive perspective. I mean, naming a lot of the things that Trump then capitalized on. And so this movement was not perfect. It was not nearly diverse enough in the United States. It was talking about systems in a way that hadn't happened in a long time. And it was, I think one of the most significant things about it was that it was a genuinely internationalist movement, and that it was happening all over the place, whether in Argentina and India and the Philippines. And there was a global conversation that was happening. And when September 11th happened, it was just like the door slammed, and we felt it immediately, like just the end of this conversation. We are no longer going to be talking about capitalism. We are no longer going to be talking about the global, it was like, for us, it was very, we had been protesting outside the World Trade Organization, and here you had, the Twin Towers, and it was a little too close. And so the other thing that was happening is that there was a right before 9/11, there was a surge in global conversation about reparations and really the unfinished business of liberation. And that was really peaking at the World Conference on Racism in Durban, which was in many ways related to this phenomenon. And it was really about, okay, well, there's freedom and there's equality on paper in a lot of different ways, but it's very significant that this was happening in South Africa. The whole idea of having that conference in South Africa was to sort of celebrate the end of racism, right? I mean, this was post-apartheid South Africa. It was supposed to be this great photo op, and it ended up being these huge protests and uprising in Durban with people saying, well, wait a minute, apartheid ended, but things are becoming more unequal. People are having their water and electricity cut off. There were no reparations. And it was just like, wait a minute, addressing racism is starting to get a lot more expensive. The US walked out. That was September 9th was when that happened, September 9th, 2001. And Bill Fletcher, I wrote an article about sort of whatever happened to Durban and whatever, this was a time when Manning Marable was writing about reparations in Time magazine. And this is what I mean. It was systems talk was in the air. Redistribution of wealth was in the air. And Bill Fletcher described it to me for this piece that I wrote in Harper's. He said it was as if someone pressed a giant delete button. So I think sort of being part of these movements and then experiencing that erasure after 9/11 and the blowback and the pushback made me really interested in how shocks are instrumentalized by elites. And then what happened after that is I started covering the invasion of Iraq. I went to Iraq for Harper's, and what I was there just a few months after the U.S. invasion and after the occupation began, and the bombs were still going off, and pretty much all the other journalists were focused on covering the bombs. But with everybody focused on the bombs, you had Paul Bremer writing this flurry of decrees: privatize this state companies, deregulate, 15% flat tax, like just pushing through the wish list. So that was sort of what put me on the journey. And then when I wrote the book, I actually thought it was going to be quite a narrow book about Iraq and this more recent period where it seemed to me that it was no longer possible to advance this ideological project, this radical form of capitalism, with any veneer of consent. So now it was having to ride on the backs of wars, terrorist attacks. Then Katrina happened. The Asian tsunami was another example of what I call disaster capitalism. But then what I realized is that they had been doing this all along, and that this is the story of how neoliberalism advanced, and indeed this is the story of capitalism. So it ended up, I ended up taking another look at all of these sort of punctuated these periods when you had these big advances for this project, whether it was post-Soviet Russia or whether it was China, and looking at the role of large-scale shocks in creating the atmosphere and creating the state of exception and the state of emergency, the collective trauma to push this through. But what was your experience?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because how you described what happened after 9/11 resonated for me, in part because at that time, when 9/11 occurred, I was directing the Racial Justice Project at the ACLU in California, and we had spent years building this campaign against racial profiling. We had called it the DWB campaign, the Driving While Black or Brown campaign, and we had started out in the beginning dealing with police chiefs who denied that there was even such a thing as racial profiling, or that there was any disparities whatsoever in the rates at which they stopped and searched people for traffic stops or pedestrian stops. There was just blanket denials. The argument was that racial profiling was just a figment of the collective imagination of black and brown people. And we, began holding town halls and doing organizing and demonstrations and media campaigns and filing lawsuits, and spent years to get to the point where police departments were now collecting data voluntarily on who was stopped and searched, or being forced to through consent decrees. And some states were thinking about collecting data, and we were finally at a point where even Bill Clinton himself was willing to acknowledge that racial profiling was a thing and that we needed to address the ways in which the police systematically were targeting people of color for stop searches and abuse. And then 9/11 hit, and the conversation just changed overnight. And not only were all of the conferences and meetings that were planned about how we're going to put it to an end to racial profiling virtually scrapped, but even within communities of color, suddenly we began to hear people say, well, maybe profiling of Muslims is a good idea in Plains. Maybe we need to give latitude to law enforcement here or there. And it opened up this opportunity for the Patriot Act and for the government to ram through, surveillance programs that have hurt probably communities of color as much or more than the imagined terrorists that are lurking in our communities. And so how radically things changed after 9/11 in terms of the efforts to bring attention to systematic police abuse, for me was
And the police were the heroes.
yeah, they absolutely became the heroes. But just recently I heard a clip with where Donald Trump was asked a question about what he thought would be needed or necessary to unite this very polarized nation in this moment.
Yeah.
And he said something to the effect, I don't remember the exact language, but something to the effect of, well, it would have to be, a big shock, a big crisis, something like war. And, it made me aware that, we could be facing the potential for a shock moment, and that they're quite ready with their laundry list their wish list of all of the changes that they would like to ram through. And I know you've spoken and written a little bit about how we ought to respond in a moment of shock and what we shouldn't do in those moments.
Right. So, it's like the word shock, right, is sometimes we use it loosely, right? And we kind of use it sometimes interchangeably with something big and bad happening, right? And this is why, part of what I wanted to do after Trump was elected was challenge this idea, because everybody, like so many people use this phrase, shock, about Trump, which absolves people of any response. If he is this shock, if he is this bolt from the blue, that means that we have no narrative to put him into, right? Because what a shock is not something big and bad happening. You can have a happy shock, right? A shock is something that happens that you do not yet have a narrative to metabolize, right? So, for those, many of you remember that feeling after September 11th, right? Of just like, this is not something that happens in this country, right? This is that sense of total unreality about that. And that is a very vulnerable place to be, right? And what elites did in that moment when they wanted to push through the Patriot Act was push people back from the most sensible thing that they wanted to do, which is talk to each other, which is historicize the event, right? Make sense of it, right? All kinds of books that were putting 9/11 in context were suddenly bestsellers, like Noam Chomsky's book. But immediately it was anybody who puts this event in context is on the side of the terrorists, and you're either with us or against us. There can be no explanation except for that they hate our freedom. And you should go shopping. You shouldn't be meeting, in squares, talking with people and having discussions to metabolize it, because that's how you get out of shock. But all of these were strategies to keep people in shock, right? That there could be no explanation, that it came out of nowhere, that it had no history, that it had no context. So the way you deal, like if we do find ourselves in one of those moments under Trump, the first thing we need to do is just remember what it is that we know, right? And history is the best shock absorber. And we have to, let go of that sort of naivete that I think some people like to cling to, right? That is comforting. And I don't think Trump is a shock. And I think he's the most cliched outcome, that we could have ever, like if you'd have written a novel predicting this 2 years ago, it would have been like, no, this is just bad fiction, like it's too predictable, So yeah, what resists, what works in those moments is putting the events in context, trusting your pre-shock analysis to metabolize it, getting together. And in those moments where your rights are going to be attacked, taking to the streets in massive numbers, right? Because I think, I'm watching, one of the most amazing moments of the early days of the Trump presidency was when he tried to pass the Muslim travel ban, and people in this city and in other cities just immediately responded, went to airports, said no, and blocked roads. And I thought it was incredible, but one of the things I have to admit that I thought was, if they had an excuse, all of this would be banned. There would be huge repression against these protests, right? And in those moments, the only thing that works is huge numbers. We've seen this in Spain. But I have some examples of moments when people have been told to stay in their homes for their own good, when states of emergencies have been declared. The only thing that ever works is immediate defiance. Immediate defiance. But we are like, this isn't theoretical about what they would do. I just got back from Puerto Rico. They're doing it. Mm-hmm. They're doing it in Puerto Rico. And it's so sick.
Yes.
People, like hundreds of thousands of people, do not have electricity, do not have clean water, are scrambling to put their lives back together. I mean, after an event like this, New Yorkers know, after Sandy, when you're dealing with FEMA, you're dealing with your insurance brokers, and it's everybody, including the political organizers. And what people forget about Puerto Rico is that a few months before Maria, they had 100,000 people in the streets against austerity on May 1, 2017. They had a 72-day student strike against plans to cut hundreds of millions of dollars from the University of Puerto Rico's budget. It was a huge anti-austerity moment when Puerto Ricans were demanding, an audit of this completely odious and illegitimate debt. And they weren't completely stopping austerity, but a lot of this agenda was stalled. They had the wish list. They wanted to privatize everything. It's always the same. They want to privatize everything, just like Trump's infrastructure plan. They want to massively contract and privatize the public sphere. So they want charter schools. They haven't been able to get charter schools in Puerto Rico. They want to privatize the electricity system. Yeah. So, when I was in Puerto Rico, they are using the fact that people do not have electricity and are desperate for anything to use that moment to announce that they're going to privatize the most important sector in the country, electricity. They announced that they're going to close 300 schools. And they're introducing charters and vouchers. It's Katrina all over again. And people are resisting. I mean, there's been amazing organizing by teachers' unions, by parents, where they tried to close down schools, and it's the same thing. They organized, they occupied, they forced the schools to reopen because they understood. They know what happened in New Orleans after Katrina. There's been amazing organizing and exchanges of information between teachers' unions about and how to prevent this from happening. But the other thing that's happened is also, like New Orleans, a deliberate depopulation of the island. 300,000 people have left. It's the only efficient thing that FEMA has managed to do, is get Puerto Ricans out of Puerto Rico. And then that becomes the rationale for closing the schools and the rest of it. So, this isn't about what they would do if they had a shock. They're doing it. They're doing it right now. So if people want to stop the shock doctrine, support Puerto Rico. Support amazing. Support Our Power NYC. Support Uprose in Brooklyn. I mean, there's fantastic organizing going on right now, and I was really lucky to be traveling with Elizabeth Jean-Pierre from Uprose and a great delegation from the Climate Justice Alliance. There were people from the Black Dirt Farm Collective who were rebuilding agroecological farms. So I also saw some of the most beautiful things. I also saw there were these moments, where people absolutely get that there is this race against time. They have their plan, but people also saw that it was the agroecological farmers who were some of the only people with food, because they didn't have monocrops. They had diversified crops, including root vegetables that survived the storm. So when nobody had food, they had food. I talked to a lot of people whose solar panels survived the storm, so they were the only people with power. And now, people want solar power in Puerto Rico, but they don't want it to be, Elon Musk controlling everything. They want community-controlled renewable energy. So The amazing, like, I think they're showing how you actually resist the shock doctrine, which is not just saying no to the bad ideas, but coming forward in these moments with real solutions, with people-led solutions that get at the underlying reasons why these shocks are hitting us in the first place. And so it's, it's the yes and the no that we need to do in these moments.
Well, I'm so glad you mentioned.
Sorry, I got carried away.
No, I'm so glad. I'm so glad. I wanted to ask you about Puerto Rico and Katrina, because we know now that we're going to be having more of those kinds of shocks in the future, climate-driven shocks, and to be prepared for them so that we're not in a situation where people, are overrun by the wish list the minute the storm hits. Your book, This Changes Everything, did help to change nearly everything for me in terms of my thinking about climate change. I certainly would count myself as someone who has always cared about the environment and trusted science and was worried about what climate change might mean for the planet 100 years from now, 200 years from now. And over the years, as the studies began to trickle in showing that we were in more and more imminent danger, I became more and more concerned. But I have to admit that in many ways I was stuck in my own silo. My work around bias in policing and to end mass incarceration, I think often I found myself tempted, when reading and speaking with people who were all the way in terms of environmental activism, I would find myself thinking, yeah, I feel bad for the spotted owls, but does anybody care about, the millions of folks who are being swept off the street and locked in cages? Why do people seem to care more about the owls than the folks who are being tossed and frisked and searched on the street?
Yeah.
So on a very emotional level, I had trouble fully embracing, the movement around climate change. And even as the reports kind of came in and started showing, well, now, this small island is actually at risk of being submerged, and what's going to happen to the people that live on this small island? Their entire island is about to disappear. I would immediately begin thinking to myself, well, there are entire communities in this nation that are drowning, and I would have this reflexive response, like, why doesn't anybody care about what's happening here to poor people, to people of color who are being rounded up and locked up? And one of the things that your book, I think, really helped me to see is that the same thing that is producing climate change, which is capitalism run amok, is also very much at the core of so many of the crises that I care deeply about as well. There is no way, in my view, I don't think there's any way for us to end mass incarceration in the United States without facing squarely capitalism and the way it has wreaked havoc on poor communities and communities of color. I don't think we can do it.
How come?
This has been a journey and an evolution of my own thinking over time. But even in my book, I acknowledge that the birth of mass incarceration was really the result of a perfect storm. It was, in part, the manifestation of white supremacy raising its head in the modern era. It was the product of a backlash against the civil rights movement. It was a way of channeling racial resentment and anger, all of the stuff that's surging today and is directed primarily at immigrants in our mainstream political discourse, all of that fear that existed among poor, working class, middle class whites, as the civil rights movement was gaining steam, that they were going to lose jobs, lose their privileged position, that their way of life was under attack, helped, to open the door to a get tough movement. Let's lock them up and throw away the key. Today we say, let's build a wall and deport them. Back, a few decades ago, it was let's lock them up and throw away the key. Well, it was partly about that. But the drug war wouldn't have been as devastating as it was if it hadn't been for the economic collapse of inner city communities that was occurring at precisely the same moment. Due to deindustrialization and globalization and factories, corporations looking for a new plantation overseas, looking for cheaper labor, they were closing down shop, and hundreds of thousands of people were suddenly out of work in places like Chicago and Detroit and Philadelphia. And the economic collapse of those communities as a result of global capitalism and capital being able to pick up and leave on a dime, leaving people, living in a state of actual depression, that was occurring at precisely the same time that this backlash against the civil rights movement was brewing, and this disposable population now could
and
be
the attacks
rounded up.
on social services.
Absolutely. Attacks on social services, and of course all of the rhetoric around welfare and the need to end welfare as we know it. And so it is now clear to me. I mean, I actually visited the Boggs Center in Detroit a couple of years ago and got a tour of Detroit and the history of what happened there and the relationship between the collapse of the auto industry and deindustrialization in Detroit and the rise of mass incarceration. And they're inextricably linked. And I think as long as we have an economic system in this country that not only requires a surplus labor pool, but is also an economic system in which capital on a dime can jump up and go, leaving vulnerable communities without work, without any pathway to survival, those communities will be viewed and treated as disposable, as they have been in the war on drugs, the Get Tough movement, the rise of mass incarceration, and the rise of mass deportation. And so I'd love for you to share a little bit about why you believe that climate change, this crisis of climate change, can't possibly be addressed without facing capitalism itself. You say in your book, absolutely nothing less will do, and that if we fail to do it in a truly heroic and courageous way within the next few years.
And I wrote that in 2014.
Yeah. You said, well, that we're going to be facing really catastrophic climate changes sooner rather than later.
And we are. I mean, this is the other thing that I think is important. When you used to think about climate change as something that was sort of off in the future, right? And that future has gotten closer and closer and closer. And if we just think about what has happened in last summer and fall, and even into the winter with the LA wildfires, I mean, with these serial superstorms just pounding Florida, Houston, Puerto Rico, the Caribbean, but even just restricting it to this country. I mean, the record-breaking fires in California, Montana, I mean, this has all been happening at once. This is like a 5-alarm fire. Every alarm in our house is going off, trying to get our attention, and we're paying attention to Trump's tweets, right? And this is one of my messages in This Changes Everything is people are capable. We don't have to wait for elites to declare an emergency. People can declare an emergency. Emergencies can be declared from below, and indeed, it has only ever been from below when something that had been naturalized, treated as normal, was declared immoral and unacceptable from below that we've ever had any massive social change, right? It isn't elites that suddenly declare that slavery is immoral or that women should have full rights. I mean, these are emergencies declared from below, not because something new is happening, but because there's a new understanding of what is happening and a critical mass of people willing to do something about it. But, you know, with climate change, so my argument in This Changes Everything is it's really just about the science of, you know, how quickly we need to cut emissions now that we have procrastinated for more than a quarter of a century. We've been having meetings about climate change now, intergovernmental meetings. The first one was in 1988. So, you know, for longer than the lives of, you know, many of the people in this room, our politicians have been having annual meetings to talk about lowering emissions, and year after year emissions have gone up, right? So the fact is that if you know, I like to quote Michael Mann, who's a great climate scientist at University of Pennsylvania. He talks about the procrastination penalty, like what you need to do about a problem if you procrastinate for 2.5 decades and make it a lot worse during that time is different than what you would have needed to do if you had listened to those scientists at the beginning of this process. And, you know, part of the problem, you know, in the climate, like what I saw as somebody who didn't come from the climate movement, who came from much more of an economic justice, human rights perspective. I mean, that was the work that I had done up, you know, for the Shock Doctrine and No Logo, and then Katrina happened. And what I saw with Katrina was this collision of intersecting crises, right? Where you had the legacy of that 30-year war, now 40-year war waged on the public sphere, the neglect of public infrastructure, the warning after warning that the levees wouldn't hold, the ignoring of the levees, of those warnings, and that weak infrastructure intersecting with heavy weather of the kind that we're going to see more and more of because of climate change. And the system fails, not just the levees, but the whole system fails, right? FEMA can't find New Orleans for 5 days, right? And there's no evacuation. People are completely abandoned. So you see all the decay, all the abandonment. And it's inseparable from white supremacy because it is not for nothing that this happens in New Orleans, that this happens in Puerto Rico, that the people who are treated as most disposable are black and brown people, and not just in the United States, around the world. Because climate change has been real for a long time, right? For people living in low-lying island states, you know, for people in the Sahel, it has been real for a very long time, but there has been a calculation made about it's been a cost-benefit analysis about the value of life, about the value of human lives. And the cost-benefit analysis was the people who are on the front lines of this crisis, who will be hit first and worst, are not economically significant enough. And that's why we have petered away the past 2.5 decades, to the point now that if we want to avoid catastrophic climate change, we now need to cut our emissions so quickly and so deeply that, you know, it's a level of change that is not compatible with the current economic system that we have. So first of all, it's completely incompatible with neoliberalism. So, you know, the tenets of neoliberalism are deregulation, are privatization, are get out of the way of the markets, right? Are cut taxes, what we've just seen from the Republicans. If you want to deal with climate change, you need to massively transform how we live, how we move ourselves around, how we generate energy, how we live in cities, right? That requires money. So it is completely antithetical to the logic of austerity, to handing out tax cuts to the rich, to privatizing essential services, because essential services like electricity, you know, what we've seen in states like Nevada and Florida is that the private energy producers are not interested in renewable energy because they don't want their customers to be their competitors. Because if you put solar panels on your roof, you're generating your own electricity, you can feed it into the grid. Why would you want that if you're a big energy provider and you're based on the profit motive? That's why in Germany, hundreds of cities and towns have reversed the privatizations of their electricity systems so that they can get to 100% renewable energy, because privatization was a major barrier to acting on climate change, which isn't to say that there aren't lousy public utilities that are also burning coal and are also retrograde, but it is to say that if something is public, we have the chance, at least, to change how they do things, as opposed to a private monopoly, which is much, much harder. So there's all of that. There's neoliberalism. But then there's also just the problem of, if you, like what climate scientists tell us now is that we need, in countries like the United States, we need to be cutting our emissions by about 10% a year. So that is not anything that any economist in the world will tell you is compatible with economic growth. And economic growth is at the very heart of the capitalist project. So, you know, when I first started that book, I did think that it was really about neoliberalism, like sort of like maybe we could go to a sort of kinder, gentler capitalism, but it isn't that. It really is about, I mean, what you talked about earlier. It comes down to values, it comes down to materialism, it comes down to how much is enough, because we're not going to get out of this without asking some hard questions about how much is enough. Not just how we get our electricity, but how much power we use, how much of the Earth's resources we use. You know, you can have economic growth with a slight decrease in emissions. Like we've gotten to that point with technology, but not the kind of deep emissions cuts with an economic system that is built to pursue economic growth at all costs and short-term profits at all costs, and that has made mass consumption a collective goal in and of itself. These are incompatible. And this is why, like, nothing has radicalized me more than climate science. You know, to really reckon with the numbers, to really talk to the leading emission reduction experts, is to understand the depths of change. Now, I think this makes a lot of liberals panicked because, you know, the pushback that I get from this changes everything is, well, like, you're making our jobs harder. I hear that all the time, you know, like this is a sellable issue. We can get bipartisan support sometime off in the future. Just, you know, it's not helpful to talk about capitalism. And that, no, I hear that all the time. But what that overlooks, and this comes back to the question of silos, is that capitalism is failing the majority of people on this planet with or without climate change, right? So if the only reason to want system change was those spotted owls or some problem that felt abstract compared to all the other problems, then I would believe that we are well and truly cooked. The thing that gives me hope is that I believe that there is an understanding, particularly among the millennial generation, that this system is in crisis and failing them, you know, at every level. It's the gig economy, it's a rigged economy, it is the economy of mass incarceration, it is a brutal system, and there is a hunger for deep transformation. And, you know, I believe that what climate change does is put us on a deadline. And it tells us that we just can't afford to lose, that this time we have to win, that our movements have to come together. And of course they're interrelated.
Have we blown past that deadline?
So we've blown past the deadline of, you know, we've blown past the deadline of like everything being, you know, fine. Yeah, things are not fine now. Like the future is rocky, but there are degrees of bad. And the truth is, I can't, you know, with the speed of, you know, of ice melt right now, you know, I can't say to you honestly that we haven't completely blown it for coastal cities. I can't say that. We don't know how quickly it's going to move, but one thing I do know is that whether or not we have blown it, that shift in values, you know, that in this church 50 years ago, or almost 51, Reverend King called that revolution in values from a thing-oriented society to a people-oriented society. That is even more important,
Yeah.
Michelle, if we've blown it,
Right.
right? Because I believe part of what we're seeing with the increasingly unmasked white supremacy and massive surge in anti-immigrant sentiment, not just in this country, but in many countries, is what I call climate brutalism. I think it comes in part from a place of understanding that we are entering into a time where a whole lot of people are going to be pushed from their homes. And in the same way that systems of colonialism and slavery required unmasked white supremacy and systems, of the creation of race and rationales that said, yeah, it's okay to steal those people's land because they don't actually count as people and they're not really here, and it's okay to enslave those people because for the same reasons. When so many people are moving, and they are moving, right? There have to be theories that rationalize the fortressing, if those are the people we're going to be in the face of this crisis, right? And so, we have a decision to make about what kind of people we're going to be. And what we're seeing is, we're the kind of people that are abandoning Puerto Rico. We are the kind of people that are allowing thousands upon thousands of people to die in the Mediterranean right now, right? And it's going to get worse. So if we are going to be people who cherish life, who believe deeply in equality, then we are going to respond to these crises and these shocks differently than if we don't, right? And so, I think that values talk, we need to do it, right? And
Well, the question really, as you're saying, is who are we?
Yeah.
Who are we as a people? Who are we individually and collectively? Do we truly value the dignity and humanity of each and every life, no matter who you are, where you came from, what you may have done? And if we do, what is required of us now? What's required of us, at this moment in time in our history? And, what I hear you saying and what came through loud and clear in your book is that what's required of us now is a sense of fierce urgency, and that we are going to have to act with more courage and more boldness than we ever have before, and that we're going to have to stand up to capitalism and to the systems of greed and corruption that have manifested themselves not only in storms and rising sea levels, but that system can be found at the core of nearly everything that we claim to be fighting against, whether it's mass incarceration or mass deportation or the fight for living wages, that at the core of all of these movements, we see a denial of the dignity and humanity of all life because of a commitment to greed and to profit and to viewing some human beings as disposable. And one of the great contributions of your last book, I think, is the way it ends with such a stunningly optimistic note. It's a book which I highly recommend to everyone. No is not enough. That's
the best
really
parts
about
are quotes of Michelle, by the way.
that's about what's required of us in the Trump era, and why resistance and no it isn't enough. But you really call for us to activate our kind of radical imagination and to imagine that we do, in fact, have the power to give birth not just to a new nation and a new democracy, but that we can co-create a new world, and we need to think of our movements in more international terms. I want to read one quote from your book because it stands, I think, in such stark contrast right now to a lot of the kind of pessimism that exists as a result of the current administration. And you write this in part having reflected on your experience at Standing Rock and what you witnessed there in terms of people coming from all corners of the earth to stand with indigenous communities that were being threatened at that time. And you talked about the importance of reclaiming a utopian tradition that's animated so many transcendent social movements in the past. And you write, quote, "It is this imaginative capacity, the ability to envision a world radically different from the present, that has been largely missing from our movements. In the West, there is little popular memory of any other kind of economic system. There are specific cultures and communities, most notably indigenous communities, that have vigilantly kept alive memories and models of other ways to live, not based on ownership of land and the endless extraction of profit. But most of us who are outside those traditions find ourselves fully within capitalism's matrix. So while we can demand slight improvements to our current conditions, imagining something else is entirely more difficult. But you insist that it's necessary and that it's possible and that the current Democratic Party hasn't been up to the challenge, but that our movements have shown evidence that we're capable of much more than we've achieved to date. And I wonder if you could just kind of end, because we only have a few minutes here left, by sharing your experience with drafting this Leap Manifesto in Canada, which is a bold new vision for our future. In many ways, I think it is a wonderful complement to the platform that was created by the Movement for Black Lives, which was also beautifully intersectional, and in recognizing the necessity of challenging not only capitalism and imperialism and patriarchy, but placing climate change and climate justice at the center of our work.
And I mean, the thing is these issues are connected. Like once we start making the connections are obvious, and it's actually work to keep them apart. One of the things I've come to understand about this history that we've been living in, this sort of counter-revolution that was launched in the 70s and really peaked here in the 80s, is that ideological project, which in most parts of the world is called neoliberalism, it is in crisis. The policies themselves are widely discredited, right? I mean, people understand that tax cuts don't create jobs. They understand that privatization is not going to bring lower costs and more efficiency. That shiny sales job is over. But the sturdiest part of the neoliberal project is the war on the imagination. It was that idea that summed up in that famous phrase of Margaret Thatcher's, "There is no alternative." That there is nothing beyond the bleak borders of this worldview. Don't you dare imagine anything else. And that was the the chutzpah of, if you pardon me in the church, of of Francis Fukuyama declaring the end of history. I mean, can you imagine? You're saying that this is the end point of human evolution. There will be nothing else. There will be no more experiments. This is the only way. We're locking it down now, right? And so it was a combination of a lot of shame that associated with failed industrial centralized socialist projects, undemocratic ones, and that war on the imagination that I think made that muscle atrophy for a long time. So, I mean, what I would say about the utopian imagination is it is a muscle, right? We have to exercise it like any other muscle, and get together in groups of people and look each other in the eye and dare to dream about what we want instead. And it feels really awkward at first, you know? But it gets easier, and I think art has a huge role to play in locating that part of ourselves. I think faith has a huge role to play, absolutely a huge role to play. I mean, we talked about climate change. I think, you know, the best piece of writing about climate change is Pope Francis's encyclical on ecology. I mean, I don't agree with him on everything, but that is an incredibly beautiful piece of writing that awakens people on another level about the sacredness of creation. And we need to speak to people, you know, at every level. And so what you're referring to, this experiment that we did in Canada a few years ago, we were in the middle of an election campaign. We looked around, we saw that none of the parties that had a chance of winning, including our left party, had a platform that was in any way up to our historical moment. That was, you know, it was still reformism. Everybody had picked their oil pipeline that they were cheering for. We weren't connecting the dots between this crisis in indigenous rights and a crisis of inequality and climate change. Everything was siloed. Everything was a laundry list. It wasn't a vision. It wasn't a story. And so a group of 60 of us from these different movements, a little bit like that meeting where we met, we locked ourselves in a room and we just decided that we were going to write a people's platform. And it was very hard work. It really was awkward. We were really lucky to be facilitated by Adrienne Marie Brown. Some of you may know her wonderful work. She's one of the gifted facilitators in the world, and she was partnered with somebody from labor, because one named Darcy Martin, so that, you know, one of the really difficult things was, you know, having people from the labor movement, labor union representing workers in the Alberta tar sands, and the head of Greenpeace, and Indigenous elders, you know, who were on the front lines of the battles against pipelines, and just having these very, very difficult discussions to get to this place of, you know, what is the common ground that we can find, and what is the story that connects. And it was, I'm not going to go through everything that's in the final document. If people want to read it, it's called the Leap Manifesto. I have it at the end of the book. It's online. It's basically the length of an op-ed, but it's a manifesto for caring for the earth and for each other. And it is about shifting from this economy and culture and society that is based on endless extraction and disposal, as if there are no consequences, both of the Earth's systems on which we rely, and on human labor, and on and on the social safety net, which we treat as if we can push to the breaking point and there will be no consequence. This idea that actions don't have a reaction, to a culture of care and repair of the planet and of each other. And so from that sort of paradigm shift, there are these lists of concrete policies, because it isn't just about saying, well, we want to change the kind of people we want to be. We also have to talk about the systems that keep us from being those people, right? Yes. And so it's, you know, everything, the core, you know, begins with respecting the original caretakers of the land, of the water, and the planet. So that begins with fully implementing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And so the core principles are that the people who have gotten the worst deal in our current system of extraction and disposal and containment need to be first in line to benefit from this grand transition. So we're guided by the science. We have to get to 100% renewable energy as quickly as science demands, but we need to embed justice in every aspect of the transition. So that means that front lines have to be first in line. We also, it means that polluters have to pay, and we worked with a team of economists about how to do this and how to cost it out. That was good. The other thing we wanted to do was redefine what a climate job was. So, and this is what I mean by, climate change can be a catalyst, right? It just puts us on a deadline. It gives us a bit of a frame, which is the frame we're all in, which is this planet, right? It's helpful that way. We already have a frame. It's our home. And when we talk about green jobs, we usually think of guys with hard hats putting up solar panels. But one of the things that we realized is that there's a lot of low carbon work that is done that is not recognized as low carbon work, as being part of the transition that we need. And that it overwhelmingly is the work of care, is the work of teaching, is the work of nursing, is the work overwhelmingly done by women of color that is undervalued and under attack by the logic of austerity, which is at war with life on Earth and has to be disposed of. That's one thing we can dispose of. So it goes on, but what was fun about it was this intervention in an election, and people didn't know what to make of it, right? Because we had hundreds of groups that lined up behind it. We had, I know Canadian celebrity is an oxymoron, but we did have a lot of them, including the late Leonard Cohen, which was very exciting for us. So a lot of artists stood with it, and that actually made a big difference, that to have the arts community stand with it to the extent that they did, and they really did. Like a lot of musicians, a lot of filmmakers, a lot of novelists, and then unions and green groups and migrant rights groups. And so we've been organizing with this, and it's very much a live document. My friends from the Leap are organizing an event tonight in Ottawa, and they've got hundreds of people in a room talking about how we take this further. And we've got an LA Leap group that is seeing if they can do this in LA. And it's all I would say about it is that work of dreaming together is, it's not like kumbaya. It's hard. It's really hard. And through the process of that meeting and writing the draft, because I was the keeper of track changes, which for somebody who's always written alone, it was hell on earth. And I wanted to quit so many times. Like, I was just like, this is a terrible idea. This is not worth it. This is just awful. And we went through with it, and it's just had this amazing life, which just to me has shown that there is, if we actually, it isn't about handing it down from on high. There has to be a story of collective ownership. Like, it can't just be a couple of smart people locked themselves up and figured it all out, because that's not the times we live in. It has to be a process where people feel like we birthed this. We birthed this together, and yes, we will fight for it because we birthed it.
Yes, yes, and it seems to me that the moment that we're in right now is one in which I think calls us to participate in a process of rebirthing this nation. That it isn't enough to just thinking about how do we make a more perfect union, but how of this history of slavery, enslavement, genocide, Jim Crow, mass incarceration, ghettoization, mass deportation, all the ways in which patriarchy and rape culture and homophobia and all of how out of all of this do we now birth a new nation that honors each and every one of us and the planet as a whole? And that process you describe of people coming together in small groups to ask that question collectively, and then not just do it in a feel-good way or here's our collective values, the things we stand for, but to translate it into a document, a living document that you can then go out and organize and fight for. I think that's something that actually faith communities could embrace nationwide, that kind of practice. When you talk about utopian imagination, certainly indigenous communities have held on to a different understanding of how to live in right relationship with one another and the planet over these centuries. But it's also true that all kinds of different faith traditions have held on to a utopian kind of imagination. and a commitment to a set of values, which if we put into practice and we're willing to fight for in a real way, could shake the foundations of the political and economic orders that are causing so much suffering today. So I want to know if we have any time for questions. Yes? Great. Okay, I know that there's a couple of people who are interested in asking questions and had submitted them ahead of time. And I don't know where you are, but I trust that, okay. You could raise your hand.
Thank you so much for being here tonight, Ms. Klein. My name is Gabrielle Sclafani. I'm a Union theological student. And I had a question, I hope they gave it to you ahead of time because it's a little long, about social centers in Europe. In June 2001, in an article titled "Something May Be Beautiful," you wrote about your experience visiting a social center on the outskirts of Rome. Social centers, you write, are abandoned buildings that have been occupied by squatters and transformed into cultural and political hubs, explicitly free from both the market and from state control. You pointed out that, in addition to creating these alternative economies, some of the activists that run these centers are also running for office and winning. Since Trump's election, do you see leftists in the US developing similar strategies to fight government corruption and global capitalism? Could such communal experiments in the US take hold in the way they have in Italy and other EU nations, to the point that they would act as meaningful resistance to Trump? And finally, does the current spate of leftist women, people of color, and young people offer hope in this direction? Or will they be summarily co-opted by the neoliberal establishment?
There's a lot there.
Yes.
Look, I think there's some amazing things that are happening in this country right now, both in terms of the cooperative economy and in new electoral politics initiatives. And I think Cooperation Jackson is an incredible example of that. Michelle was talking about Detroit. Like in the rubble, in the deindustrialization rubble, we are seeing some really inspiring examples of, and a lot of it is inspired by co-op movements in Latin America, maybe less so Europe. But I think your question about entering into politics, I mean, I think there is more of, I think we're in this moment of tension around how we're going to respond to Trump, of like whether or not we're going to have kind of thin coalitions where we paper over sort of like amnesiac unity, right? Where you try to build as broad a coalition as possible, and the cost of that is really what we know of the very recent past, right? I mean, the kind of whitewashing of the Bush administration that is going on these days is pretty extraordinary. Even of what happened during the Obama years is being forgotten in some of, in the name of unity. But then I also think there is definitely a growing desire to associate with more of an ideological movement that has a theory of power, has a political platform, and is articulating alternatives. Michelle mentioned the Vision for Black Lives, which is a platform. It is it was articulated as a platform, and I think it's really encouraging that membership in DSA and the Democratic Socialists of America has exploded since Trump came to power, and are running candidates who really understand what it is that they're running for. So, I'm not sure that the idea that it's just about everybody run and just sort of ordinary people run. I mean, I think it's good for good people to run, but I think it is a really intense machine, and if there isn't a very clear plan and solidarity between people who are running and a clear political project and a clear political platform. And I'm, as you heard, like a fan of people's platforms. I don't think we should wait for politicians to do this work for us. I think that a lot of that work can be done from below. And then, that's kind of what the Tea Party did with Republicans. I mean, they said, here's the platform, you better follow the platform or we're going to get rid of you. I mean, obviously, there was a lot of astroturf in there, but I think that there can be a genuine people's platform that then says to politicians, you adhere to this thing. But one of the things that I take heart in this moment is I think that people are willing to try a lot of different strategies simultaneously. And the truth is we're going to need all of it. So I think, those new economic models and also running for office at every level. I don't know. We were going to talk about the Democratic Party, weren't we?
Yes. Well, I think we have one or two more questions.
Hi, Michelle.
Hi.
And hi, Naomi. Thank you for doing this. I'm Dara Baldwin. I am a policy analyst, and I do disability policy. And today, the United States House of Representatives passed a bill, the first bill to weaken a civil right legislatively. Civil rights are weakened through judiciary, like the VRA was weakened in 2013. But this is the first time. And we are fighting this, and we're not going to give up. And I know you all know ADAPT, who was in McConnell's office, and they got arrested again all week. So thank you. That we're getting them out of jail right now, so please, we hope we have enough money. But they were on the floor today. And also, you talked about moderate Democrats. The vote was 225 to 192. 12 Democrats voted for this bill to weaken a civil right. Representative Jackie Spear from California, who's also helping the Me Too. And when you were talking about collaboration, how do we do that? How do we make sure that these legislators, and believe me, 45 is a problem. I will not use his name. He is a problem, but we concentrate on that. That legislation is a problem too. The Congress is a problem. And then, and them doing things like this, exactly what I just said, right, Jackie Spear. Now the disability community, right, are we gonna be upset, or not, with the sexual harassment community because Jackie Spear is helping them to take away their 90-day cool-off day, but she just gave us one. The bill that passed does not allow people to sue if they can't get into a building. And the ADA, American with Disabilities Act, is 28 years old. So she just weakened our chances to fight. But isn't that what the sexual harassment is a weakening? So how do we stop these people and not let that wedge come between us? We love the sexual harassment work that's being done, and we want it to be done. But the collaboration you were talking about, when you keep passing laws like this, you're pitting us against each other. So what is the message to people to not allow them to do that to us?
Yeah.
Well, I want to just jump in to say that a lot of people do have optimism about what will be happening in this next round of elections and the opportunities for Democrats to be voted into office in a lot of places, perhaps that were solid red and nobody thought that they had a chance before. But I think what you're talking about right now is an excellent example of why any old Democrat just doesn't do. That we actually have to be willing to support candidates who are committed to, the vision that we're describing here. And that's part of the reason why having something like a clearly defined platform that is a test that can be used to determine whether someone who is running for office truly is committed to valuing the dignity and value in each and every one of us, truly will stand up for people who are disabled, who will stand up for those who are suffering from sexual harassment or rape, will also stand up with indigenous communities, will also be there for the folks who are getting locked up and locked out or shipped, over the border. That we need to be able to have a way of ensuring that the people that we're going to the polls to vote for are actually committed to the principles and the values and the politics that we share. And today, it's very difficult to do that. And we saw just recently a huge mobilization effort to get one particular Democrat in office where, it turns out that he may not actually be standing in solidarity with so many of our movements and the causes that we believe in. And so it is not enough for Democrats simply to win. We will not be winning in the long run if we do not find a way to either take over the Democratic Party or to separate from it in some meaningful way. Otherwise, we will be trapped in a perpetual cycle of supporting neoliberalism.
And I mean, this what just happened today, what Dara's talking about, is very telling, because the part of the Americans for Disabilities Act that they want to roll back, they got through one stage, but they haven't won yet, is the part that allows people to sue businesses for access, right? So it's an expensive part, right? And I think that's telling that it did get support from some Democrats, right? Because I think this is part of what we've seen is a willingness to grant rights that don't cost all that much, and they're really about leaving the system intact, but providing access to that, greater access to that system, unless it costs real money, unless there is a redistributive element to it, right? I mean, that's the scary. That's when rights get scary, right? And that tells us that that's exactly where we need to fight, right? And I think that part of what you're talking about underlines how important it is for us to be unified by those values of deep inclusion and cherishing of everyone, right? And deep love. And then that's the lens that we apply to every one of these crises that we face. So we stop seeing them as I'll show up for your issue if you show up for mine, because it's all connected, right? Which isn't to say that we're erasing the differences between our movements, because of course there are differences and there are particularities, but this idea that they're even separable, I think, is what we need to be getting away from. Because that is, what happened today is just about throwing away a class of people and say you don't matter. Like, that's what happened. And that will not be the last group of people that gets thrown away. I mean, it was monstrous what happened today. Thank you, Dara, for all of your work.
Yes. And I want to say thank you to Naomi for your work and for what you've shared here, and for embracing the spirit of revolutionary love as not something that is just sentimental or feel-good feeling, but revolutionary love in practice is something you have committed your life to. And I know that there's so many people here who appreciate your work and what you've shared
and
today.
Michelle, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight.